Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you this morning on St. Luke's Day. 2 months ago, when Reverend Vern asked if I could speak today at St. Luke's Day, to speak with healthcare workers in mind, I looked at the set readings for the day and especially asked if we could use today's readings rather than St. Luke's readings, which are set for Friday, which is the actual day on which St. Luke's is celebrated. Because there's something quite beautiful and helpful about the words of Jesus that we've heard today, particularly for us who find ourselves in the difficult working environments of the public sector healthcare. I've worked at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, which is a branch of the National Health Laboratory Service, for almost 20 years. And this week, on one of our leadership WhatsApp groups, one of my colleagues posted a comment complaining about the services at our work. Today we have no air conditioning, she said, and the temperatures are over 30 in the laboratory and we can't test our samples. And there's no water in the lab, and there's been no security at the entrance to our premises for weeks because the controlled card access is not working. And this place, she said, is falling apart. And her comment came on the back of a second data collapse of our data systems because the air conditioners had failed and the servers had overheated. And also this week a pipe burst in the lab that I worked in, and we're in the middle of a rubella outbreak with over 1,000 samples needing testing, and we had to stop because it was impossible to work in the laboratory. I think my situation is not unique. Many of us who work in government agencies, municipalities or schools, and particularly in the private health sector, are experiencing similar things. And the failings are not limited to infrastructure. Procurement, HR, and finance systems are also struggling, and the spin-off consequences are terrible. The system delays or fails to purchase things that we need to do our jobs. Endless deviations and following a paper from one signatory to the next is required to get the simplest things purchased. Sometimes HR seems ineffectual in the face of unions, and managers struggle to hold people accountable when they don't do their jobs. When people leave, they're not replaced for months, if at all. And every now and then we get a glimpse into one of the underlying reasons for these failures. The murder of Babita Diokaran brought into the public eye some of the most awful corruption in the Gauteng Department of Health. At Tembisa Hospital, 2 groups had taken hold of the hospital procurement system and bypassed the usual checks and balances, leading to millions of rands lost to fake or overinflated tenders. And who knows how much of the dysfunction that we experience from day to day is due to corruption. People in senior positions turning a blind eye, or worse still, using the system to make their fortunes. All of this leads to a feeling of complete disempowerment amongst us who find ourselves employed in these systems, but also to the people who need the help that these systems offer. We see the difficulties around us, but we're utterly helpless to make things better. We feel helpless. And all of this recently came to the public eye in a big way through Tom London and his videos on X, when he publicly named and shamed medical students, doctors, nurses, and administrators of Hill and Joseph Hospital. For us who care about our work, his words stung, but we know he spoke the truth. But at the same time, we are trapped. If we take the courageous step to speak out, like Dr. Tim de Meyer did at Rahima Musa Hospital, we risk losing our jobs and our mental health. So what is to be done? Our gospel reading from the 10th chapter of Mark has some help and consolation for us. The story has Jesus and his disciples making their way up to Jerusalem. The scene has been set, and Jesus has just told his disciples for a second time that he must face suffering and death. And while they're walking on the road, James and John find a moment to be with Jesus when he's alone, and they say to him, Jesus, please do what we ask. Jesus open-heartedly responds, What do you want me to do? We want to sit at your left hand and at your right hand when you come into glory, they say. What a preposterous request. They're actually asking for power. They're saying to Jesus, when you are recognized by people and held up as the king that you rightly are, we want to be your chief advisors. We want to be the ones who mediate access to you. We want to have power. It also tells something else about the disciples, that they hadn't heard. They hadn't heard Jesus' message. They hadn't understood. They hadn't taken in what Jesus' life was all about. I think Jesus did a double take, and he comes back with a retort. Can you drink the cup of suffering that I will drink? And yes, they say, glibly, missing the point that Jesus phrased this question as a rhetorical question. The answer is evidently no. We as observers to this text are astounded at James and John. What did they think when Jesus told them that he must go to Jerusalem to suffer and die? Were they not paying attention when they saw how angered the Pharisees were when Jesus healed on the Sabbath and started murmuring to kill him? What an arrogance of James and John. And who do they think they are to sidle up to Jesus and ask this sort of question without the knowledge of the other disciples? But Jesus, in his answer, silences them. And as we think about the immensity and significance of what Jesus says, we too are silenced, like Job in the face of the mightiness and beauty of God and God's power in creation, as we heard in our reading. When we initially look at Jesus' response, we see the ironies and contradictions. Here are James and John, who actually wanted to share Jesus' power, but we, the reader, know that they will share Jesus' suffering and that they will abandon Jesus and run away when it comes to the crunch. We see James and John, who hate the Gentiles, regard the Romans as faithless, yet we see them behave in just the same way as the Romans do, as Jesus pointed out. They want to grab power for themselves, just like the Gentile leaders lord it over the very people they serve. And then we, as the reader or listener, hear Jesus share a timeless truth, how that those who get what they want from this corrupt world will actually be the last in Jesus' kingdom, and that those who want to be great in truth, rather than lord it over the people they're responsible for, need to be the servants of the people. But what was Jesus saying beyond the contrasts and the ironies? The clue is found in the small verse in 45, the small word in verse 45, rather hopelessly translated into English as ransom. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to give his life as a ransom for many." There isn't a word in English for the Greek word that this comes from. It comes from the slave trade, a time when people in the Roman Empire and the ancient world were bought and sold as things called slaves, a possession of someone else. A human being, a body who has no choices in life, no dignity, no personhood, who is literally unseen as we look past a tool that is used for a purpose and no other. Now, slaves were bought and sold as commodities in the Near Middle East during Jesus' time. There is a famous surviving legal code from one of the Assyrian kings prescribing regulations for how these slaves, these things, were to be, business around them was to be conducted. Slaves were regarded as assets of their owners, and on the owner's death they passed to the heirs. But a slave could purchase their freedom and become a freed man if, and only if, they compensated the owner an enormous sum of money, up to 5 to 8 years' annual wages for hired labor, or even more if the slave had acquired special skills. The Greek word for this money, this cost, is lutron. And this is the word that our Bibles have translated is ransom. Jesus describes himself as being the ransom the lutron, the fee that sets trapped people free. For the Son of Man came, he said, not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. Not only is Jesus' orientation, his mindset, and his outlook given over to serving others, but his mission in life, his very lifeblood, and that which motivates him and drives him, is to bestow personhood, choice, dignity, and freedom to those who are enslaved. And Jesus says of himself, I came to serve, to do this very act, to set people free. Jesus is saying to James and John, you have got this very wrong. In asking for power, you've totally misunderstood my mission. Jesus is saying, my system is not about looking after myself or oneself. My system, this way of being, the true way of being, is about serving others, about putting oneself aside to look at the big picture and to serve what is really meaningful. If you really want to be first in this, my system, the true system, you'll land up being last in the world of selfish gain, last in the world of the power hungry. In my world, in God's system, you've got to serve others, not yourself. And so where does that leave us who are trapped in this world, in what seems a lot of the time to be a failing system, a system where chances of those who scheme, the wicked and sometimes evil folk, take advantage of loopholes for their personal gain? As we watch, we see many things falling into decay. What are we to do? I think Jesus offers us some beautiful insights here. The first is that we, like James and John, need to recognize the true system that we are working in, the eternal system, God's kingdom. Yes, there is failing infrastructure around us and corruption, but the true system is Jesus' system, where being a servant, having a servant heart, gets us close to Jesus and pleases our Creator. Let our attitude be like Jesus, who was not out to serve himself or his own power and glory, but was rather faithful to his mission of freeing slaves. So in practical terms, what does this mean? It means an orientation to the other, to valuing service over personal gain. In business literature, there's a style of leadership called servant leadership, and I understand that the term was coined in the 1970s for the first time. I think they hadn't read the gospel or understood Jesus' message. But it's helpful that they say that servant leadership is different from other leadership styles because it values service to others over personal gain, builds influence through persuasion and authenticity, and is focused on the growth of others. Servant leaders share power and help their team members to achieve greatness through caring leadership. As Christians, we do more than exercise servant leadership. For to us, service to others, love for others, is the way our system, Jesus' system, works. Sometimes in a world where we're overwhelmed by seemingly impossible contexts, it's hard to know what to do. For a while I belonged to an AA group, and they had a little paper that they gave to visitors that said, do the next right thing. And essentially that means focus on what we are employed to do and do that. In the last few days we've been celebrating the life of a beloved civil servant, Tito Mboweni. Our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, says of him in this morning's papers, you were a true servant leader, admired and beloved by the people. You delivered on what was required of you. And so even while the system is seemingly failing around us, let us rather be like James and John on the lookout for an opportunity to do good. Of course, they were on the lookout for an opportunity to self-advance their ambitions, but we can be on the lookout to do the next right thing. And sometimes the next right thing can simply be to answer the email that we need to get to in the course of a busy day, or perhaps wash the dishes in the kitchen when we take our coffee cup back there. But perhaps sometimes it can be bigger, to sign a petition, to join a protest, to speak out. Cara told me yesterday that she went to a protest to speak about the fact that there's no water here in Coronationville. And one can be faced with choices. One can sigh that there is no water and go to the shop and buy a 5 litre, or one can join and do something active in a small way, a seemingly small way, but that enables one's voice and the voice of others to be heard, to live in a way that is orientated towards the other, towards community. Another treasure that AA offers us is to recognize what we can and can't do. And sometimes the next right thing is utterly impossible for us. A friend of mine was an accountant at Transnet in the early days when corruption that we now know about was just setting in. She saw what was happening and was in a position to blow the whistle. But she was a single mom and she had 2 kids to support, and her mental health was precarious. She was not able to blow the whistle, but she did the next right thing, and that was that she left and she found another job. She couldn't fix the system, but she also did not need to be a part of it. And there is a beautiful prayer for this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Lastly, a small thing we can offer ourselves is to debrief, to share our trials with each other, our small successes in a difficult system, and our big frustrations. In this way, we can know that we are not alone, and we can support ourselves to do what is right and to do our best in the system around us. I want to close with a story. Just before Tom London did his thing on X, I had to refer a friend and colleague, Nontando, to Helen Joseph Hospital. She was terribly ill, she was confused, she had a fever, and she developed a horrible rash all over her body with sores in her mouth. And she had something like Stevens-Johnson's syndrome, for those who know what it is. Her time in casualty was terrible. She spent 48 hours on a bed, a stretcher downstairs in the triage. But in 2 days, she had every investigation she needed. CT brain, chest x-ray, bloods, ultrasound, skin biopsy, and she'd been assessed by 3 specialists. On the 3rd night when she was in the ward, I managed to get through security to visit her, and I found her alone in the ward. I had taken some yogurt for her, knowing that she found it hard to eat. And whilst I was there, an enrolled nurse came in to do her vitals, and we started chatting. I heard about how hard it is in the ward, how few staff there were, and how much work there was to do. While I was there, the nurse in charge of the section came and discovered that I wasn't actually Dr. MacCarthy checking up on a patient, but I was a visitor for Nontando. And she came to me and she wanted to chase me out. And I had no opportunity to give Nontando the yogurt that I had given. But the staff nurse, kind as she was and overworked as she was, said to me, I'll give it to her. And it's these small acts of kindness, these small acts that affirm the dignity of a person, that were, in the face of it, something that perhaps the staff nurse didn't have to do because she had so many other jobs to do. These small kindnesses are the things that make life better for all of us, where even in a failing system, we can offer the hope of dignity and respect and love for people, knowing that we follow the example of Jesus Christ, the servant leader. Amen.